Hello, welcome to the webinar, The Commercial Future of Water, Microplastics, PFAS, and Consumer Trust. My name is Abhirab Basu. I'm a senior analyst here at Lux Research, and I will be moderating today's session. This webinar is co-presented by Lux Research and BlueTech Research, bringing together consumer insights and water innovation expertise in a dynamic, co-branded discussion. Presenting today is my colleague Cheryl Auger, Senior Director, Consumer Insights at Lux Research. Joining Cheryl are two representatives from BlueTech Research, Dr. Ali Ling, Assistant Professor in the Civil Engineering Department at the University of St. Thomas. Ali is a member of the BlueTech Technology Assessment Group. Joining Ali is Jacob Steele, Senior Research Analyst at BlueTech Research. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the question box on your screen. Time permitting, we will answer all the questions that we can. If your question does not get answered, please don't hesitate to email it at questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we will respond. If at any point you experience technical difficulties, such as a frozen screen, simply refresh your browser and check that your internet connection is strong. All right, now let's jump directly into the presentation. On to you, Ali.
Thanks, Abhirab. I'm going to start by giving a little bit of a context into what we're talking about, and then I'll get more in detail. So we're talking today about microplastics and PFAS and how those connect to consumer trust in water. This opening and framing, that's kind of what we're doing now. And then there's going to be separate presentations from BlueTech and Lux. Jacob and I from BlueTech will talk about the state of the market in terms of technology and regulatory perspectives. And then Cheryl from Lux will be talking about consumer trust and perception and some insights from their research. And then at the end, we'll have a discussion where all four of us are discussing some questions and context and kind of connecting the dots between the different topics. So before we get into trust and microplastics and PFAS, I want to start by talking about what is safe drinking water and how far we've come over time. This graph here shows 1885 to 1945, and these are a number of typhoid fever cases. And you can see over time, as additional drinking water treatment gets put in, slow sand filtration, disinfection, as those get put in, the typhoid fever cases drop precipitously. So the advances that we've made in sanitation and drinking water treatment so far have already basically eliminated fecal oral diseases in many countries. This enables the high density communities that we have today, and it also saves lots of lives. So compared to how we could be with drinking water, we're actually in a pretty good case, especially with acute types of diseases that can make you sick tomorrow. Drinking water regulations are typically targeting contaminants. So it could be things like these bacteria that make you sick, but also it can target contaminants that could make you sick more in the long run, things like PFAS and microplastics. A lot of those drinking water regulations were passed before infrastructure aging became a big problem. And that's another thing that we need to think about when we think about the quality of drinking water here. We need the drinking water to be safe, but we also need it to be reliable. It doesn't matter how safe it is if it doesn't make it to the tap. And there's a lot of uses that people have for water that's not just drinking. Even if you buy bottled water or whatever else you choose to do for your drinking water, you still are going to want reliable water coming to your house so you can shower and run your dishwasher and all of that stuff. In the United States, it's estimated that we need about $625 billion over the next 20 years just to maintain our drinking water infrastructure as it is. And that doesn't include addressing any sort of new stuff like PFAS or microplastics. All right, so let's talk a little bit about distrust. One of the main causes and issues with distrust is that local events in drinking water can drive widespread concerns. Some examples from this are the lead crisis in Flint, Michigan about 10 years ago, more recent service failures in Jackson, Mississippi, and stories about PFAS in drinking water in specific communities. So it's natural as people, and I think this is very common where people hear about these types of events and they say, oh, that must be an issue where I am. I should worry about lead in my water or PFAS in my water. And that's not always necessarily the case. The other thing here is that drinking water is tied to trust in government more than a lot of the other basic utilities that we have, because a lot of drinking water utilities are operated by local governments. So this figure is, this is from Manny Teodoro, who's a professor at University of Wisconsin in a book of his, but If you see failure in tap water where something's not working, it leads to reduced trust in utilities and government, and increased consumption of commercial water like bottled water or filtered water, reduced citizen participation and incentives for making that water better. So it's actually harder to fix that problem when that problem happens. It's also difficult to secure funding to maintain infrastructure when these systems are run by local governments. It's usually not very popular to pass an increase in water rates if those politicians are going to need to be reelected in the next cycle, even when those increases are really critical to maintaining the water infrastructure and maintaining the quality of life that we have now. So what do we do? You know, I'm from the drinking water sector as an engineer. One thing we can do is if we have more excellent tap water and fewer of these types of events, we can increase trust in utilities and government, reduce that commercial water consumption, increase participation, and then also increase more resources to maintain that excellent tap water quality. So there's a relationship between maintaining excellent tap water quality and maintaining excellent tap water quality. And that really involves communication with consumers and really building trust. So I talked about kind of local events can drive widespread concerns. I want to talk a little bit more about what that means and what that looks like. These figures are from a scientific study that happened last year, and these folks looked at publicly available data in the United States in drinking water. And that's very widely available if you want to know what's in your drinking water. But they looked at a bunch of different classes of chemicals, and you can see the 4 classes here. They compared the concentrations in drinking water to the concentrations of what's considered safe in drinking water. So if you see something in gray here, it means that it's below the level that is considered a problem. So it's safe. If you see colors that are yellow, orange, up to red, those are representing drinking water concentrations of things that are higher than what is considered safe. So more of like a problem. And the actual community water issues vary widely by community, and it's not just PFAS and microplastics. It's inorganics on the bottom left here, things like lead, like arsenic, like chromium-6. The top right is disinfection byproducts. So disinfecting our water saves millions of lives by limiting fecal oral diseases, but there are some chemicals that are formed in that process, and there's some steps you can take to decrease those. PFAS are on the list of some with some concern in some specific places. And then there's other organics like pesticides and solvents. So the takeaway here is that just because there's a problem with drinking water somewhere doesn't mean there's a problem with drinking water where you are. So when we try to solve these problems, whether it's on an individual basis or on a community-wide basis, we need to first understand like what are the problems in your specific community, and it varies a lot by place. So how do you remove some of these things? I just have a graph here of some specific advanced drinking water technologies. The ones we'll talk about most are reverse osmosis membranes and granular activated carbon adsorption. Both of these are available as an in-home unit if you wanted to do that, but they also can be applied at large community scales. They're pretty good at removing PFAS and microplastics and a lot of other things. Advanced oxidation and biofiltration, those are some systems that are used at community scales, and they're really good at some things and often less expensive than some of the other ones, but they're not super great for PFAS. So we'll get back to these in-home units a little bit later in the talk. I'm going to hand it over to Jacob, who is going to talk a little bit about specific regulations and innovations.
Thanks, Ali. So there are federal limits on PFAS in drinking water in the US, which utilities must now meet by 2031. And the question is, how do we get there? There's been growing public awareness of PFAS compounds over the last 20 years. And those who've seen the 2019 film Dark Waters might know that it dramatizes a West Virginia town's fight to hold DuPont liable for PFAS contamination in the drinking water supply in the early 2000s. In 2015, the 2 most widespread PFAS compounds, PFOA and PFOS, were phased out of production in the US, and it has been observed decreases in PFAS and decreases in the levels of those compounds in blood levels in the US has been observed. But at the same time, there has been a shift from these long-chain PFAS compounds towards other shorter-chain PFAS compounds, which may also have adverse human health effects. Over the last few years, the science has really advanced, and the regulatory landscape has developed quickly when it comes to PFAS in drinking water. In 2022, the US EPA established that there are essentially no safe levels of PFAS exposure. And in 2024, exposure to PFOA and PFOS at least. And in 2024, the US EPA established national primary drinking water standards for 6 PFAS compounds, including PFOA and PFOS. In 2025, with the change in administration, these standards were revised to cover only PFOA and PFOS, removing limits for the 4 other compounds. However, practically, this represents only a very minor change in the number of drinking water utilities required to implement treatment systems to meet these regulations. With estimated annual compliance costs projected to exceed $3 billion per year due to an estimated 10 to 15% of US drinking water utilities nationwide being required to upgrade their treatment plants, these regulations have raised questions about cost benefits to consumers and also raised alarm among certain consumers and environmental groups about drinking water quality. Microplastics are another category of emerging contaminants which seem to be gaining traction in the public's mind. But the regulatory landscape in the US is not as mature as it is for PFAS. And the links between microplastics exposure and adverse human health effects may be weaker than for PFAS. California has been leading the way here, establishing the first standard methods for microplastics analysis in drinking water and requiring 4 years of monitoring of microplastics in drinking water supply at 30 large drinking water utilities, and that monitoring is ongoing. The US EPA is considering a nationwide study of microplastics in drinking water and is being petitioned by environmental groups to do so. And this data could potentially pave the way towards future regulation of microplastics in drinking water in tandem with ongoing research into the health effects of exposure to microplastics in drinking water. When it comes to microplastics, there's relatively limited investment and spending to talk about to date, given the lack of regulations, but it's a different story when it comes to PFAS. And, one of the things that we track at BlueTech Research is where is the money going? And there's a few different ways to look at this. One is where is the venture capital and investment dollars going? As Ali covered, there are some standard technologies for PFAS removal from drinking water, which are commercially established and mature, like granular activated carbon and reverse osmosis membranes. These technologies, however, transfer the PFAS from liquid to solid media, but don't actually destroy them. And this can result in the PFAS being reintroduced into the environment if the media or leftover residual streams are improperly disposed of. And by design, PFAS are extremely difficult to destroy because of the strong carbon-fluorine bonds. However, to fully close the loop on PFAS, PFAS destruction technologies may be required. Most of the venture capital investment in this market has been into PFAS destruction technologies. Examples of technology providers are shown on this slide here. PFAS destruction technology can interrupt the PFAS cycle by actually degrading the compounds, but it's generally costly and technically challenging to apply this at scale. And there's been over $800 million raised by PFAS treatment companies, examples of which are shown here. But the second category we think about things is, where the real money is going, and that's being spent by drinking water utilities to meet the national primary drinking water standards, which, as mentioned previously, the spending may exceed $3 billion per year in the coming years. And as we'll discuss further, we also have reason to believe PFAS and microplastics are driving consumers towards increased spending on at-home filtration and bottled water.
Great. Thank you so much for the presentations. Now I'm going to talk a bit more about a consumer perspective. And note, there's a bit of a gap between what we've heard and how consumers are approaching safe drinking water. And when it comes to trust in water, safety is absolutely table stakes. Consumers expect that they will not get sick from drinking their tap water, but this is only one part of the trust equation. As we've heard about advances in treatment, we see consumer expectations in the US have grown. In fact, many consumers are increasingly concerned about taking a preventative approach to their overall health and thinking about their health in the long term. As such, they're looking for ways to increase their water consumption, and they expect their water to be not just safe, but clean and pure. They believe that water is essential not only to our basic bodily functions, but increasingly we see consumers are making connections between water and other health benefits, things like detoxification, improved digestion, improved skin health, weight management, even mental clarity and alertness. And so, given that there is this important role of water in health promotion, not just avoiding getting sick, consumers are looking, as I said, to find ways to make tap water taste better, or to enjoy their water a little bit more, right? So they're looking at taste as part of that trust equation. Not only that, but for many consumers, taste is a sensory experience that they believe alerts them to whether or not their water is truly safe and pure and clean. So they're looking for water that tastes neutral, it tastes fresh, and it tastes soft. And that is all part of how they're thinking about whether or not they trust their water. Now, having said that, when we take a closer look at what safe drinking water means for consumers, we can see that this is a very mature idea. That is, when I use some of our tools to explore how much consensus there is when it comes to what safe means, it's a very established idea. This is not something being driven by a niche population or environmentalists. This is a very mainstream and established concern that cuts across many different groups of consumers in the US. But at the same time, there's a gap here. Consumers are increasingly distrustful of their tap water. And as Ali mentioned, this is in part because of past contamination incidents. Flint, Michigan comes to mind. It leaves lasting skepticism about the safety of municipal tap water. Furthermore, consumers feel, and this is where there's also a gap based on what Ali and Jacob told us, that there's inconsistent standards across different regions, making them question enforcement and reliability. And furthermore, while there is public information available, many consumers aren't 100% sure how to access it, where to find it. Sometimes it feels a little bit scientific and not necessarily accessible. So we see some consumers complain about a lack of transparency. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that media and new social media often amplify consumer concerns, making some of these concerns feel greater than they are, helping to explain why contamination incidences in places that are far away are still on some consumers' radar. Now, if we continue to look at some of the concerns that consumers have, they range. They're concerned about the mineral content of their water. They're concerned about additives like chlorine and fluoride. They're also concerned about metals like lead, as well as chemicals, including PFAS and other contaminants like microplastics. And then, of course, bacteria does come up. But we see consumers are increasingly concerned about microplastics in the water and in the environment. This is because they worry about the health impact of microplastics on people. They worry about exposure to toxic chemicals and carcinogens, and they're concerned that ingesting microplastics could be linked to serious long-term health issues, those chronic issues that Ali mentioned, things like cancer. Furthermore, microplastics in the water challenge this notion that water is pure. They're questioning whether or not, and this is really important because it's relevant to both tap and bottled water, but they're questioning, can it truly be safe in the presence of these contaminants? Furthermore, people are worried that these microplastics are not just a health concern for us, but an environmental concern. They are aware that these tiny plastic particles can release harmful chemicals, and that can impact both on human health, but also on source water, which explains part of their concern about bottled water. Furthermore, what's interesting here is that the plastic bottle, that single-use plastic bottle, is tied to a larger concern about pollution. So there is an awareness that turning to plastic bottled drinking water can contribute to the microplastic problem overall. Finally, this does lead to some trust issues. With increasing reports of contaminants like microplastics, consumers are skeptical. They're wondering, can they continue to trust the government? And increasingly, we may see them questioning whether or not they can trust brands that offer bottled water. So they're looking for solutions. Some are looking to reduce the reliance on single-use plastic, looking to avoid bottled water in the first place. Others are turning to bottled water brands that they trust, whereas others are looking for reusable or biodegradable solutions. So ultimately, consumers are worried about microplastics as a growing concern. And what's notable is we're seeing a shift to a concern about both tap and bottled water in this context. Another issue that we've talked about today is PFAS. And here, consumers, again, it's not the easiest topic for our average consumer. It is a lot of chemistry at its heart, but at the end of the day, consumers are worried about, again, health risks that can arrive due to contaminated water. They're worried about negative impacts on the immune system, potential links to cancer. So again, thinking about some of those chronic or longer term health implications, driving them to be more vigilant about their water source. Part of this concern is due to just a rising awareness of PFAS contamination. This is in part due to increased media coverage as well as some of the health campaigns. And it's leading to questions about the safety of drinking water, again, whether it's tap or bottled. When it comes to PFAS and regulations, we heard Jacob mention that regulations are growing. This is on the government's radar, but consumers are still worried about a lack of stringent regulations. They're worried not only about regulations on water, but what they're also worried about is government action to address PFAS contamination in the first place. Right? So consumers are aware that PFAS are in some of the items that we use, things like nonstick cookware, as well as water repellent fabrics. And that's raising some concerns for people about how do we hold manufacturers accountable for releasing PFAS into the environment in the first place? So they're thinking about the source. Nonetheless, they would also like to see increased or improved filtration system or ways to remove PFAS from the water. And all of this is to say, Jacob was exactly right. What we see happening as a result of this distrust is many consumers are taking water safety into their own hands. They are looking at different options, whether that's bottled, filtration systems. We see middle-class consumers in particular are turning to at-home filtration systems in an effort to keep their water safe, pure, and great tasting. We also see that many consumers are turning to bottled water, and this is particularly true for lower income as well as African American and Hispanic consumers. But they're choosing bottled for its perceived purity, taste, and its marketed safety over tap. And finally, some consumers, they may have filtered it, but still find it doesn't taste exactly to their preference. And this is where we see the growth of things like water enhancers, customizing water with flavor, adding electrolyte powders or other powders to boost the health benefits of their water. But again, all in all, what we're seeing here is consumers are trying to find ways to take safety into their own hands in a context where there is some distrust. So I'll turn things back to Ali to give us a few key takeaways.
Thanks, Cheryl. Yeah, a few of the takeaways just from what we've been talking about as a group. The first one is that consumer concerns don't always align with real risks. So the things we see in drinking water that are actual health risks are not necessarily things that people are concerned about. So it raises the question is, should water utilities cater more to consumer concerns? Can we help consumers better understand real risks? How do we bridge that disconnect? The second one is that distrust in drinking water drives market and profits for in-home water treatment and bottled water. So trying to figure out what is the role of these companies if utilities don't rise to meet the challenge of providing excellent drinking water. And then we really see an opportunity for innovations that solve both regulatory risk issues as well as consumer-driven challenges. So innovations and technologies that are really bridging that. So an example is with PFAS regulations and some of those treatment, there's both consumer-driven concerns as well as regulatory and risk concerns. And when it comes down to what happens, there's kind of three main alternatives out there right now for options for water quality options. So one is communities invest in excellent municipal water. This is by far the cheapest per liter treated, but it treats basically all the water that comes to your house, including things that you use to water your lawn and run your dishwasher and run your washing machine and all that kind of stuff. The benefit here is it is easier to reuse and recycle materials that are used at the community level, as opposed to under the sink water filtration. All that stuff ends up basically in the landfill. When we look about cost for excellent municipal water quality, it varies a lot by size, but for large cities with a big system, this is going to be the cheapest option. For under sink water filtration, again, Cheryl mentioned that this is getting to be more common in middle class households, especially those who want a certain taste or feel for their water. This costs a little bit more per liter treated, but again, you usually would just put it on your kitchen sink, so it's just treating things that you would drink or cook with. Some of the issues here is that the homeowner needs to replace the units. It's not like my job as a homeowner is to maintain the drinking water treatment system like it is the operator at the municipal facility. It's difficult to reuse components. And then there's also, depending on where you get it, sometimes there are pretty high company markups here. The third option here is bottled water, and that's typically just for water that people drink. It's by far the costliest, both per liter and per household per year, even if you're just buying water to drink. By far the biggest issue with bottled water is that it's not necessarily safer than municipal water. I think there's a perception that it is, but it is not as strictly regulated as municipal water. When it comes to plastics, there are very likely to be more microplastics just because it sits in that plastic and that can degrade over time. And so more of that, its costs are a lot more, and most of those will go to the company who's selling that product. So that's kind of what we see as the future and kind of some of the cost considerations and other going through that. I think we're all going to come on and have a little discussion here.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Ali, Jacob, Cheryl. That was really interesting. We will now be taking some questions that you may have on the presentation. You can go into the question box and type in the question. I already see some questions queuing up. If we don't get to your questions on this call, someone from Lux will be in touch after the webinar. Let me start looking at some of these questions in the queue. I see one here. Ali, let me come to you with this. You shared some interesting information around the consumer distrust and its consequences. Flint, Michigan being a good example, not too far from where I live, actually. So do you think that's changing, or what utilities, technology developers prioritizing more what consumers actually care about in this case?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think lead is one of those things that people care about and also is a big issue. I think water utilities are also always trying, they're trying to meet their regulations, which are to keep things healthy, and they're also trying to provide a product to their constituents. The main challenge for drinking water utilities is funding, right? So I mentioned that $625 billion deficit over 20 years in the United States, and it can be really challenging to convince ratepayers in a specific community that it's worth their money to pay to maintain their water quality as it is, or even increase it. So I know that in Flint, Michigan, that lead came as a result of cost cutting, which was a very poor decision on the account of those engineers there, and was very bad outcomes. But I think really the limitation there is with how much funding those utilities have, and where they can make decisions to apply those fundings to both reduce real health risks and also to address consumer concerns.
Yeah, great. Regarding the funding and the investments, I see another question here around that. Let me come to Jacob. Jacob, you showed some interesting data around, hundreds of millions of dollars invested in PFAS destruction technologies. So the question is, there's in many markets, consumers still have very limited awareness of the PFAS risk. So do you see that gap between that investment needed and the consumer perception out there? How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when we're talking in the drinking water context, utilities have a bit of a conundrum. As Ali mentioned, we've moved past treating drinking water to protect against acute illnesses, and now really we're looking at protecting against chronic illnesses from exposure from contaminants like PFAS, and which really can pose a long-term risk rather than an acute one. It's very difficult for water utilities and the water sector in general, I think, to communicate effectively to the public about risks for these kind of long-term risks. For example, what might be the potential increase in cancer risk a consumer might have if they're exposed to drinking water with, say, 40 parts per trillion of PFOA versus 4 parts per trillion for PFOA. I think that's a really difficult public communications exercise for drinking water utilities to, first of all, acknowledge and educate the public where there is PFAS found in drinking water treatment supplies, to not conceal that and be open about what the data is showing, but also try and communicate that these health risks need to be put in context compared to health risks of other exposure to other compounds that we get through other means, for example, and other day-to-day risks that are part of our life. And so I think in the water sector we all have a role to play in trying to communicate to the public about water quality, cost-benefit trade-offs, and in an effective way. And I think ultimately utilities may need to invest further to upgrade treatment systems, as I discussed, to address compliance with PFAS drinking water regulations. And I think that's, utilities, as they embark on that path, they also need to think very carefully about their communications strategy to both inform consumers who may not be aware of the issue, as well as try and assuage concerns from those who are aware of the issue and are concerned that they are, potentially being exposed to risks of adverse health effects due to drinking tap water with PFAS in it.
Yeah, great. And kind of going beyond the just boil water notices, kind of invest in, explaining those challenges, because as they expand their treatment or technology capabilities. But I do want to come back to this kind of trust rebuilding bit, and I see a question around that, particularly from the CPG side. If utilities can't rebuild that trust, particularly around these contaminant issues, PFAS, microplastics. Cheryl, I'm going to come to you with this. Does that create an opening for bottled water brands, for CPG brands to step in to provide more of that trusted source? Is there an opportunity there?
Yeah, I think to a large extent, the large growth that we've seen in the consumption of bottled water in the last 10 to 15 years is in part brands stepping in to fill a gap for consumers and taking advantage of an opportunity. And from a consumer perspective, water is in an interesting spot because it's a necessity, but at the same time, consumers can choose between drinking water from the tap or all sorts of other beverages. And so from a consumer perception, They may be thinking about water as something that's both necessary for their health, but also something that is, I could drink water, or I could have a soda, or I could have some flavored water. And so consumers have a range of choices. They have more choice in what they consume than they've ever had before. And I think that complicates the question and really places emphasis on the need for that clear, accessible communication with consumers from government so that they better understand what their options are. But given that many consumers have already turned to bottled water, I think that trend will continue. I think consumers are kind of weighing out the odds. Do I trust this brand or do I trust the government? And it opens up some very complicated questions, but it certainly is an opportunity to fill that gap with something that consumers do see as safe. Now, where I'm curious what's going to happen in the future is, as I mentioned, we did see some growing concerns about PFAS and microplastics in bottled water. And so how is that going to change consumers' calculation around who they trust and why they trust them? So it's a great question, and it's a really complicated one in many ways.
And complicated enough not to be able to solve it in one webinar. But thank you, everyone. That's all the questions we're taking. That concludes our webinar for today. The slide presentation and recording from this webinar will be sent to all the attendees via email today. After leaving the webinar, you will be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation. We appreciate any feedback you may have to help inform and improve future webinars. Also, take a moment and check our website for upcoming webinars. That's it. Thanks for joining us, and have a great day.